Welcome to the Pixel Retentive Podcast, where we, a business owner and an artist, discuss the business of art and the art of business.
Hey friends, I'm Ross, creative director at Epic Made, and I'm the host of today's Pixel Retentive Podcast, where we share our thoughts on creativity, art, and business. Past guests include Matt Vojak of Made by Things, Jared Beasley of Astoria, and Carrie Ann King of Illuminate Labs. We're forever grateful for the supporters of the podcast, and we're always looking for more sponsors. That said, Pixel Retentive is always brought to you by the creative gurus at Epic Made. Epic Made is a team of strategists, artists, and storytellers who excel at visual storytelling. Our studio crafts unforgettable animations and illustrations that not only captivate your audience, but also drive tangible business results. We specialize in engaging, imaginative, pop culture savvy audiences with beloved clients like Nickelodeon, WWE, and Sci-Fi. Visit getepicmade.com and let's collaborate on your next creative campaign. With us today, we have Meryn Hayes. Meryn is the executive producer of Dash, which includes managing clients, projects, and the Dash Bash. Proud working mom and enrolled in a 200-hour yoga teacher training. Welcome, Meryn. Pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. This is my first solo podcast. Normally, Carl takes the solo ones, so
We got this.
Forgive me if I butchered the beginning there.
Yep, all good.
So before we jump into today's topic, I'd love for our audience to get to know you a little bit more. So some two basic questions, and then we'll get right into the topic. How long have you been in your industry, and what is the project that you're most proud of?
Ooh. I'll start with getting into the industry. I've been at Dash for about 6 years. As most producers, I've had a windy, weird journey that I think after talking to most producers, I'm like, oh yeah, we all had the same weird but different experience. My background originally was in photography, so that's what I went to school for. Thought I was going to go into advertising or photojournalism. Didn't end up wanting to do that and figured it out a little later than I would have liked towards graduation. I ended up getting a degree that included more of like a multidisciplinary kind of route, which included photography, graphic design, and then project management.
Gotcha.
And that was the first insight into, I could be involved in creative work without actually like doing the creative work myself. And so as any good millennial who graduated post 2008 recession, I didn't do anything with my career towards my BFA right after. I did a litany of strange, weird things. I was at a shoe store, managing the shoe store. I worked with kids at like a preschool. I was a tour guide in Hawaii for a few weeks. It was like a wild time. And then eventually I ended up here in Raleigh, North Carolina at an advertising agency, kind of in their baseline project management department. And so I worked my way up through the advertising ranks. You know, we worked on all the Fortune 500 companies, Google, IBM, that kind of thing. And really it opened my eyes to how I could progress in kind of this management path of creative. When I was at this advertising agency, I met the co-founders of Dash, Mac and Corey. So they were both animators at the time. We always got along really well and worked well together. And so once they started Dash, we kind of stayed in touch over the years and said like, hey, we'd love to work together at some point. And then about 6 years ago, they offered me a job, and that's history. So It's been a weird journey. And I like to tell people I never would have imagined where I am now, but couldn't have appreciated how I've gotten here. It worked out well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've had a similar journey. I graduated with animation, bachelor's in animation and media art, so like digital painting and stuff like that.
Yeah.
In 2013, so post 2008. managed a Sprint mobile store for a while, and then met Carl, and I've actually been working with him at Epic Made for the last 10 years while also doing, I guess 11 now, Jesus. And I also take work on the side as sort of a contractor freelancer situation, and do my own stuff as well. Like there's a lot of freedom at Epic Made when it comes to that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But favorite project?
Favorite project. I mean, we do a lot of really cool work. And I think one of the things that I appreciate most, and I tell clients is like a selling point, is that we're problem solvers. Like I really appreciate no matter what the creative or the look or who the client is, we problem solve. It's really hard to pick like favorite project. I think as kind of a cop out is the Dash Bash, which became its own whole huge project that none of us really anticipated, or at least didn't anticipate it becoming a reoccurring thing. I've just been so proud of what we've been able to build, and it's been something that every time we do it, it becomes bigger and better, and it really celebrates this motion community that we have, which I think is so unique, and being able to provide a space for people to meet, and they've like known each other online and they get to like meet in real life for the first time, or we get to see people like start their freelance career because they're like, the Bash gave me ideas and gave me the gumption to go try something new. I just think that's something that none of us imagined it could turn into something bigger than just an event. So
Yeah,
really,
and millennials are really bad at the whole networking connections thing. So that also helps the whole.
yeah, we're like talk to other humans.
Yeah.
And like especially post pandemic, I mean, I feel like we all need a little bit of that human connection. So
Yeah, we actually had Mac on the podcast a little while back, a few weeks ago, and I think he talked about the Dash Bash as well when he was on. So yeah, I definitely love what you guys are doing. I think it's super important for the communication skills and networking of people in our industry. Um, and and like you said, just a lot of the times you get stuck in these like weird bubbles of not really realizing that what you're doing isn't the right direction, right? There's the whole idea of practice makes perfect, but you can practice the wrong thing indefinitely and never get better at it. So I think that, you always need outside perspective as well. Yeah. I'm a big proponent of education and think tanking and whatnot.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know that there's much point if you feel like you've learned everything there is, like, so there's much more to know. So keep learning.
100%. So, and I think that kind of segues nicely into what I want to talk about today, which, today's topic, I sort of, with us kind of both being in a similar spot in our studios, I think the whole like do it all expectations in regards to clients and creative, and just like this idea that you are kind of trying to make sure that you're juggling everything, especially if you're a freelancer or managing a studio, series of artists. And you mentioned sort of in the pre-interview podcast interview that you might have some ideas on that or thoughts on that. I'd love to hear one of your takes on it.
Yeah, I think it is the world we live in just highlights that everyone is doing all the things and that they're all really good at it, like social media, Instagram. I think the way that we've grown into this culture, like idealizing people on the internet, is dangerous. And so I think it makes, and that's obviously not a new thought, but I think it just puts pressure on us, and especially as artists, if you're just seeing beautiful work everywhere and you just feel like I'll never get to that. And so I think the idea of like doing it all, I like to break that down, that no one is doing it all. And if they are, they're not doing it all well. There's this metaphor that I really like that, like, imagine you're juggling, and some of the balls you're juggling are glass and some of them are plastic. Like, you can let the plastic ones drop, but you can't let the glass ones drop. And so to me, that really comes down to priorities. And knowing that your priorities are probably going to change like on the regular, and that could be daily, weekly, monthly, like just not forgetting to check yourself on what your priorities are once you think you've got them set. Especially being a working parent, it just adds another layer of prioritization. And so I think the pressure we put on working parents, especially on working mothers, is that you should be able to do it all. There's a quote that's like, the working mother, oh, I'm going to butcher it. I should have Googled it. It's like, you should work like you're not a parent and parent like you don't work.
Right.
Like it's a double-edged sword. And so I think, to me, one of the reasons
that's a paradox, basically, right? Like,
yeah.
So we just had our first kid. He's 8 months old this month. And my wife is a stay-at-home mom. And so sort of I've had to try to juggle making sure that the whole household sort of stays afloat while making sure that I spend time with my son and making sure that I'm there for her as well, because it's not fair to her for her job to never end, right? Like, I get to clock out, but she needs to be able to do that at some point as well. So, and I can't go from job to exclusively taking care of my son, because then I never clock out. And so it's this weird balance that I think those are always glass balls, right? And so you kind of got to figure out which ones in your life are plastic and drop those occasionally so that you can make the shit work.
Yeah. I think it's never going to work all the time in the way you want it to. And for me, as someone who's like pretty type A, I'm a Virgo, I'm like all the things, that has just been maybe one of the biggest learning lessons since I became a mother, and that asking for help. And so that goes back to like what you were talking about with you and your wife, like that communication and that partnership, I mean, is good, just one of the most important keys. And maybe to bring the conversation back to work too, is like, it's about communication and collaboration. And whether that's with people in your studio or on your team, or if you're a freelancer, it's with your clients, it's managing expectations, which I think is something that's really hard, a soft skill that isn't easily learned, managing people's expectations, but then just communicating boundaries when you have them, because it's something that if you don't set them for yourself, you're going to be beholden to other people's.
Oh, 100%. And something that, touching on the social media thing, which I think if you're running your own business, this is significantly more problematic, right? With the whole managing social media and clients and marketing and et cetera, where it's really easy to look up to an idol who's doing this full time and making millions of dollars or whatever. And say, okay, well, I know that they're posting every day or twice a day or 3 times a day or whatever. And like this idea that like that's what you have to do to make it successful. And a lot of people don't take into account that there's not the person who is in front of your screen is not the only person juggling for that account, right? Like they've gotten to a place where they have resources that you do not have when you first start out. And even if you have them, like say you have a savings account of 10 grand, like anyone has that anymore. But say you have a savings account with a decent amount of money, right? It might not make sense out of the gate for you to start paying an editor, for you to start paying a photographer or a videographer, for you to start paying a secretary or a personal assistant, for you to like all of these resources that make the most successful studios or content creators capable of compounding on their success. It isn't worth it to utilize early on. You do have to just kind of go through this kind of sucks phase, right? Both from a quality standpoint and from a internal time management standpoint. And I think people are really hard on themselves when it comes to accepting that, because they only see one person in front of them, right? Like every YouTuber who has any following has an editor. And it's really difficult for people breaking into the industry to swallow having to market themselves this way and find clients and do the work.
Yeah, it's a lot. And also, like, you're not seeing the person on the YouTubers, like, their sacrifice. Like, you know, there's a world where they're staying up all night because they can't afford an editor and they're doing it, right? They're sacrificing their sleep or their time with their family, like, yeah, their health, their physical and mental health. Like, we're not all working from the same space. And it's hard to remember that when you just see on the screen and you're not remembering what else they have going on and what they're sacrificing.
We're actually seeing a lot of that now. A lot of the early adopters of YouTube are retiring because they're just like, yeah, this ruined my mental health doing it this way. I'm grateful for all of the, stability that doing this job got me, but like a 10-year stint ruined their mental health and they need to retire at 40 or whatever and not do this anymore. Whereas I think a lot of people get into the creative industry because they want to be creative and they don't want their job to ruin their passion in that sort of way.
Well, I'm like, defensive because I'm a millennial, but like, can you blame us? Because like as kids, it's like you're told, find something you love and go to school for it and you're going to get paid for it and that's going to be your life. And like we get out of school and we're just like, what? No. So I think that's just something that I hope people are able to find what brings them joy outside of this rectangle, because I think that's one big thing that other generations, I think Gen Z has a better boundary on like work and finding passions, and they're going to monetize their TikTok experience. We'll see in a few years. I think they've got a better relationship with some of those boundaries with like.
I think that there's less. So don't let the gray hair fool you. I'm also a millennial. But it is natural, but it's all stress. Don't worry about it. No, I think that Gen Z. So actually, first off, I want to go back to something that you said. I talk to my parents about this all the time. Where the whole find something that you love. My parents are great. They constantly facilitated me being an artist because that's what I was passionate about, and I know that's not the blessing that everybody has, right?
And I had the same experience, which I am appreciative of.
Absolutely. So they were like, yeah, we'll help you pay for college, which didn't even kind of dent it. And you can go to school, do what you need to do, and just follow your passion and be successful following your passion, and so on and so forth. And I think that it was honestly true when they told it to us.
Oh, sure.
Like it was actually true at a point. But by the time, 2010-ish, 2000 to 2015, that a bracket of time where like a lot of millennials ended up graduating college came around, it was no longer true or quickly becoming not true. And now everyone's saddled with a bunch of debt they can't pay off, especially creatives. And then on top of that, the rise of YouTube happened where you can now learn most of what you learned in college for free because so many people are monetizing the fact that they went to college by teaching other people what they learned and so on and so forth. And so I don't think that anyone has to feel bad about it. I think that it's just part of the process at this point. And it, feeling a sense of dread over it is only going to compound on problems that you probably don't need to be worrying about in the grand scheme of things, like stuff that's not going to really put you forward.
Yeah.
But with the Gen Z thing, I think that they have, at risk of sounding like an asshole, I think that they maybe have too symbiotic of a relationship with the internet.
No doubt.
Yeah, in a way that, like, yes, it probably hurts their mental health less because it's the same like them living and them being on social media are the same thing,
Yeah.
I think that that's arguably worse than where the wheels were at, where it's like,
Science makes me really uncomfortable, like for my daughter and like what the future.
yeah, right. I feel the same way. Yeah. It's, I don't know that it's better, or that they'll be healthier for it. But we'll have to see.
Yeah, time will tell.
But to bring things back to, sort of action, let's say actionable work environment stuff, like it's not just marketing, which is kind of like what we're talking about currently. It's not just marketing that people feel this way on, right? It's also a degree of client expectations, right? Like, or director, like I have a whole team of artists under me, right? And so like my expectations weigh on them, I'm sure, as so on and so forth. And so like navigating that, like a client's expectations or a director's expectations with your own abilities, and how do you set yourself up for success when it comes to managing a really nebulous task. Like creative is a weird thing where you can kind of just spend as many hours as you want on it, right? Like it can always technically be better, but there's a point where I feel like you need to cut it off and say this is a complete project and it's accomplished its mission. You have any thoughts or tips on like that arena?
Yeah, I mean, like any good producer, I'm gonna say like documentation. It's the opposite that a creative person's gonna want to do. I think for us, we have worked really hard over the last few years at Dash to improve our processes from like an operational standpoint, just to gain efficiencies, to be more organized, especially as we kind of like everyone was like, oh, let's go remote. We didn't know what we were doing, right? So we had to pivot our operations, especially in the post-pandemic world. And so I think one of the things on the client side that turned into is originally, we'd have a discovery meeting with a client. We'd give them a scope of work. We'd pitch our idea was, and then it'd be like, okay, go, right? Because it's probably due soon.
Yeah, right. Because it was
yesterday.
2 weeks ago. Yeah.
And so we decided to, on the advice of another producer, was to do like a kind of a production kickoff before the fun stuff happened, the creative. So we put together this template that basically just outlines the scope in a more digestible format that we literally get on a phone call with the client, and we like walk through it. And I think something about just making sure that you're having the client's attention, just knowing that they probably get a zillion emails a day, and having a little bit of that face-to-face. We basically go through like, here's what's scoped. Here's how many rounds you have. This is what we call style frames. This is what we call storyboards. Like it goes pretty nitty-gritty into like, this is what our production process is. And so for those who like have never done an animation before or just do it differently, it's just kind of like a level set. Again, it comes back to like expectations. They come into a project having their own idea of what the animation process is. That's different from ours, but we've not had like a moment to like compare that. You're just going to get surprises down the road. And so this is kind of like our gut check. Like, are we speaking the same language before we start? It goes through the schedule. I joke with our other producer, Ashley, that I know I live in such an ideal world where the schedule I make at the beginning of a project is the schedule at the end of the project. And that has never literally ever happened because shifting schedules is like the bane of my existence, but I realize it's reality. And so we'll go through the schedule and say like, hey, are you going to be on PTO this week where we're asking you to review these frames? Like, let's move that schedule. Let's know that now. And so again, I think it just goes back to level setting and making sure that we're kind of speaking the same language.
Yeah, it's always step one, make a plan. Step two, throw out the plan.
Yeah. Plan A through Z, because any good producer is like anticipating it going off the rails. So
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with you. I don't think that there is any project that we've ever had that like has followed a timeline that I've created exactly.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's possible in the creative world, really. Like, I mean, if it is possible, it's just because you got lucky, right? Like, I don't think it's possible to be consistent with it.
Yeah.
Because there's just there are things where you're working through a project and then you get an idea, like you're working through something and you're like, oh, actually this would look better if ... right? And that takes a little bit more time, and so you have to request a little bit more time from the client in favor of this thing, like, hey, let me sell you on this better idea, contingent on us
We try this.
extra extra day or whatever. And the language thing is a huge thing. I think Ruth Newberry from Cream is working on a project that is like a lexicon, like a dictionary situation for creatives, where like a storyboard means this because it doesn't mean that for everybody.
Yeah, shout out to the Creative Codex.
There it is. Yeah, the Creative Codex. Yes, yes. And there's plenty of other people working on it. I just happened to talk to Ruth about it specifically.
Yeah.
But it's I think it's a great idea, and it's something that really shines a light on the fact that like clients, we're working with a client right now who they've had stuff animated for them, but in a motion graphics capacity, and that is not the same as a 2D frame by frame like Disney caliber animation. It just doesn't. It's not the same thing, but it also doesn't output the same way.
Yeah.
Like they're super happy with the way that it looks. They're like, oh wow, like the characters have, like, I think one of the comments they gave us recently was like, it looks like the characters have a soul to them. And it's like, that's great. That's that's what we're going for. But we're also like 2 weeks behind. So, and they're okay with that, right? Like it's, there's a push and pull, and I'm also kind of a type A person. Very ADHD is my superpower situation. And I think I'm a rarity in that, and sounds like you are as well, in that I speak art and business very fluently, which is why I'm in this position, right? Like I'm sort of the nexus between the art team and the client. And I think making sure that if you're solo and you are just freelancing and you're not part of this like a huge team like we are, that you do the due diligence of saying, hey, this is what I mean by this thing, and this is the process that you're going to go through, and attaching hard dates to it might not necessarily be the best course of action, but you do need a plan that works in phases with, a detailed deliverable explanation and also constraints. Because a client you can't blame a client for being inherently selfish. Like they're spending their money to get a product, and they want it to be as perfect as possible because they're the ones losing on it.
And this is a service industry, right? You are providing a service.
100%. And so there's a lot of, I've had to pass up on hiring some people because they have this mentality of, well, I want to do my art for me, and the client will just kind of get whatever they get. And it's like, that's not how this works, right? Like that's, you go find funding and then do your thing. But there is a degree of the client might be wrong objectively, where they say that they want this thing, and it's your due diligence to try to explain that, hey, you're the professional and you went to school for this, and these are some of the reasons in lay terms why this isn't going to work super well. But at the end of the day, if they want something, then you're kind of stuck, right? You have to make the best out of it.
Yeah. And I think that's one of those things that, like, especially in the early years, like you'll just go through a few of those that might really hurt, and they like just make you more resilient. But at the end of the day, I think why it's important to go back to like, it's a job. And maybe that's like the blurry line of like your passion, right? And so just making sure that you're not taking that stuff too personally. Because again, it's like you're providing a service. I think it's Mac that said like that's the difference between a designer and an artist, right? Like as designers, we're problem solving something for a client, for a purpose.
Yeah.
And so if that line is too blurry, I think that just creates, heartache for people.
Yeah.
I also think it's important to like, for freelancers to remember that, like, if they're going out on their own and they start a freelance animation career, like, you're going to be your own producer too, unless you're working with someone. And I think people, that's not what you think of when you're like, I'm going to go animate. And so many of the skills that a good producer can bring are those soft skills and that communication and that little bit of like a gut check between the client and the creative. And you have to do that for yourself, which can be really hard. And so I think that's where it comes back to like documentation and boundaries, like you were saying, like setting up what's in scope and what's out. If you have a timeline, like I think that proactive nature can just lay the groundwork to make hopefully your life as the freelancer just easier as you're your own ref, you know.
Yeah, we actually spoke. We spoke with a friend of ours, a fellow artist and freelancer, Ivan Kander. Big mistake. Last name was Kander. His episode should be out by then, by the time this airs. But we talked to him about the importance of having a passion project that you work on for you that isn't tied to client expectations. Because this idea of like, you sometimes hear like get a job that pays the bills and then do the art if you want to be an artist, do the art outside of that time. I think that you can have both. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can have a job in the industry that is reliant on clients and then have a passion project that has nothing to do with any of that on the side that you get all of your creative expressions out. Like if you hate this decision that this client made, make the right call on your thing. Also, I'm a big believer of constraints being a positive thing for art. I think there's so many people in our industry that see the blank page as a good thing. Like they think it is in their head, right? Like, oh, I can do anything I want. But creativity,
you ideate for 2 weeks and you're like, oh yeah.
Yeah, because creativity is just problem solving. Like it's the same thing as math. It's just we don't like that word. Like
colors, yeah.
We don't like math. We got into art because we're not good at math. And
yeah.
But it's really the same thing. You're just, instead of being given numbers to solve for another number, you're given a goal, an objective, and you have to solve for that objective, right? Like you have to create the numbers to get to the objective the client wants. And if you don't have the objective and you don't have the right constraints, you're just trying to, beautiful mind it, and it's not going to work.
Yeah, oftentimes when we get quick turn requests, I know in the industry is just like people get a visceral reaction to knowing like it's a 2 or 3 week timeline, but something that it's its own challenge, and you have to think about what is feasible in 3 weeks. Like we've had a few quick turn requests this year that ended up being really cool projects because we had to collaborate in a very specific way. We had to problem solve like on day one how we were going to get through 7 days of production or whatever. And it also allows a little bit more. The deadline is, if it's driven by the client, like you got to make a decision. If there's these 2 styles, you can't say, let's mash them together for style C. Like, no, you got to pick one. And there's a little bit more like you have constraints as an artist, but you're also kind of, the timeline is almost acting as like, all right, client, you got to get your stuff together too, so we can make a decision and move quickly. So
yeah, it gives you leverage, right? That's something that I think the art community is super bad at, is using leverage. I think we feel really bad about it because I think most people who get into art, again, they kind of want, like they secretly want to do their own thing, right? Like most people don't get into this job because they want, or a form of this job, whether that's graphic design, motion design, whatever, right? Because they want to work for other people. They get into it because they have a passion for doing it. And they want to do their own thing, but they can't because they need to like pay rent and stuff.
Sure.
But I think that it prevents artists from feeling good about wielding the leverage the client puts in your lap against them, where you're basically like, if they say, hey, I need this done in 2 weeks, right? As opposed to you sacrificing and saying, okay, well, I think I could get this done if I stay up all night for the next 5 days and then eat ramen for 3 meals a day, and
Never leave the house.
I'll like get my mom to come in and feed my dog, and rather than doing that, like wielding that lever and say, okay, if you need this done in 2 weeks, here's how this shit's gonna go, and if you don't like that, move the timeline or pay me a lot more money. And sometimes the client may double the project budget. It's like, look, I didn't realize that it was going to cause that much hardship. I'm fine doubling the project budget. And maybe that all makes sense for you now. Maybe you could pay for a babysitter now. Maybe you can, whatever. Maybe it makes sense to work over the weekends or consider it overtime, right? Or maybe they say, okay, well, I actually only wanted this in 2 weeks. It actually needs to be done in 2 months. Let's actually rework the timeline then, because I do need this done and I want you to do it, but I don't want it to be rushed. They just don't know. And I think a lot of the time that's underestimated. I think that most people, when they think of being approached for a project, the client knows what they want to some degree. Like, they understand the process or they wouldn't be commissioning it. And that's just hardly ever the case.
Yeah. I think that ties into just the art of negotiation. And that's, again, something that's just like so hard to, no one knows it. You just learn it. And that
you got to feel it.
Really intimidating to like try and, client comes to you with a request and you're like, no, we can't do this. Like, saying no to someone is hard for some people, but like, here's what we can do. Like what you said, I think that's just something that is, learned. And the more that you do it, the more you get comfortable with it. I think if you go into the assumption that the client, knows what they're doing and knows what they want, like challenge that. I think there's always room for those conversations, and don't feel like if you ask questions, they're just going to like walk away. Like,
yeah, I mean, they're here because they need you, right? Like that's something that that every creative sector on the entire planet struggles with, is the idea that we are the ones making them money in the grand scheme of things, without us giving our work to movies, to businesses, to whatever. Then they lose a lot of leverage in their own businesses, right? If you're in a scope of work meeting with this client, they are here because they want you to do the work, right? And there's a good chance that they're here because they don't have any other options. So like, and they might, right? Like, that's not always the case.
Sure.
But they are in the room with you right now. And so being just honest with them is not going to lose you the project, right? You can't be an asshole either, but because that's just bad business. But being honest, and honestly, I think it was Alex Hormozy, but I've heard this sentiment a lot, was the idea that you don't actually know your worth until you push the boundary a little bit, right? So price your work 10%, 20% higher than what you feel good about, right? And then if someone's like, yeah, all right, sure. It's like, okay, that was really easy. I price it higher next time. Any day.
Yeah.
Get to the point where you hit a negotiation bar, and then you're like, okay, well, am I happy with this level of negotiation?
Yeah.
And start from there.
Yeah. I think it's also to like evaluate after a project, like both with yourself, if it's just you, or with the client and the team. Like, yeah, did they feel like they got the value out of what they paid for it? And making sure that, once you set it and it's not set in stone, keep evaluating what you're doing and how you're growing as an artist too.
And I think a good rule of thumb is to try to, it's really hard, but to try to assess how much money they're going to make from your work, right? Because it's really easy to get into this mindset of, oh, well, I want to make $50 an hour, right? And so I'm going to charge them $50 an hour. And maybe that equates to a $5,000 project, right? But if you approach Nike with a $5,000 project, they're going to take at a high quality level, right? Let's assume that you're a very talented artist and you actually get Nike's attention and say, okay, well, I'm going to charge you $5,000 because that's $50 an hour for the legitimate amount of time that this is going to take me. And I feel like $50 an hour is as much as any one person should need to make or whatever. They're going to run away with that. They're going to be like, okay, great. It's sold, right? They're not even going to look at the contract. Whereas, if you think about how much money, like the buckets of money that someone at a company like Nike is going to make from your work, it's a lot easier to value it at $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, like instead of $5,000, right? $100,000, the numbers that just feel wrong.
Yeah.
Inherently.
Yeah.
Might be in the ballpark of what your client is willing to work with if they have the right if they see the value in it.
Value of it. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's, again, a hard line to like press unless you're doing it, and what you're able to do with that just opens up options for like the future,
Yeah, I think also, like, as a caveat, I think you have to be fair, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's also not about gouging your clients, because then they're not going to come back.
Yeah.
Right? They might need you now, but they're going to find someone who's less expensive or whatever, and there's a degree of that you have to balance.
Yeah. Also, if I'm Nike and you charge stuff like $5,000, I'm gonna be like, what? I don't know. I would be suspect that you've underpaid yourself. Like, there's also.
Yeah, that's another thing, is like when you're scrolling, like making it real simple, like we're using big numbers for some people, but like making it real simple, right? If you're scrolling through Amazon and you see the same product and one of it is priced at $5 and one of them is priced at $50, you start to wonder why this thing is priced at $5. It's like, I don't know that I actually want this camera that's priced at $5, when in reality they're just pricing it for what it costs, right? It's the whole like Temu or Wish.com thing where it's like, these numbers are suspect and I can't tell whether or not I'm
happening here.
Like, I can't tell if I'm going to get a canvas with this product painted on it, or if I'm going to get the actual product.
Or, like the furniture, and then it's like doll furniture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that there's a degree of that too, where if you underprice yourself or feel like you're giving the client a good deal, it could kind of shoot you in the foot. It's also something to consider. Yeah, completely agree. Well, we are actually coming up on time a little bit. And so did you, before we wrap, did you have any like final thoughts that maybe we haven't covered yet? Or if you don't, that's perfectly fine. Just leaving the floor open.
I don't think so. We covered a lot.
Hell yeah. Okay. Yeah, I agree. I don't either. So, I think that kind of leaves us with one final question. It's the same question that we ask every guest. Which basically just to share the love a little bit. And if there's anyone or anything in your career that you'd like to shout out to the audience that maybe they might want to look up or might want to do a little bit more research into, or might be a resource for them, relevant to this discussion, do you have anybody in mind?
Yeah, I'd love to shout out the Mothers of MoGraph. So it's a whole community for mothers in the motion industry. It's something that was spun up about a year ago. There's a Slack channel. I think it goes back to like earlier we were talking about like finding community and people that you can, I don't know, agonize with. Again, like the whole like no one's doing it all. Finding a space, if it's not Mothers of MoGraph, like finding your own version of that to make sure that you have a space for yourself to see that everyone's struggling, like celebrating the highs, celebrating the lows. I think that's something that I didn't have when my daughter was first born. And so I'm just like, even though it's a virtual community, I'm just relishing in the fact that there's a space for that. And especially in this industry, I'm really proud to see so many wonderful artists, mothers in there. So shout out to the moms.
Yep. And they also bridged a bit of a gap introducing us as well. Casey
Jenny and
Smith.
Casey did. Yeah.
Casey Smith and Jenny Davis. So definitely shout outs to Mothers of MoGraph, and as well as Matt Garrison as co-founder of Dash, who was on our podcast a few weeks ago. Great time we had with him as well. And yeah, I mean, I think that's great. So we have been talking with Meryn Hayes, who's the executive producer at Dash Studio. You can check out their website at dashstudio.net. But if listeners want to follow up with you directly, where should they go? And where should they go to check out Dash Bash?
Yes. For Dash Bash, so you should either look up Dash Bash on Instagram, follow us there. We've got our next speaker lineup coming out shortly. The event is next June 11th through the 13th in Raleigh, North Carolina. So check it out. So check us out on Instagram. And then the website is dashbash.net. And then you can find me, I think the easiest place, look me up on LinkedIn, connect with me there, and would love to continue the conversation. Always down to chat with someone about expectations, client management, not doing it all.
Hell yeah. Well, I really appreciate that, Meryn. Thanks so much for being on the show. And until next time, everyone. Bye.
We really hope you enjoyed the show. Please like and subscribe to join us on our next journey through the world of art and business on the Pixel Retentive Podcast.